Todd, thank you so much for being a guest on Psyche podcast. I'm so excited that you sent me an email and reached out and asked me to have this conversation to explore your wonderful book. I can't wait to get into that. But before we do that, would you mind just spending a few moments, maybe describing a little bit of who you are and kind of what you're up to professionally? And then from there, we can jump into this conversation.
Yeah, sure. I am Timothy Owen Desmond. That's my legal name. My initials are TOD, Todd, which my parents have called me ever since I was too young to remember. So I go by Todd, but I have a PhD in philosophy and religion with a concentration in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness, which I got at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And I have a master's degree in political science with a focus on alternative futures studies. I have a master's in liberal studies from Georgetown University, and I got a bachelor's from Boston College in philosophy and political science. So I've been studying my whole life. After I got out of college in 1993, I independently studied specifically Plato and Nietzsche and the Vedanta philosophy of India, and also the overlap with quantum physics. And then I went back to school to get the PhD, first the master's degrees, because I was trying to get published, and all the publishers told me, you're not going to get published with material like this if you don't have a PhD. So I said, okay, well, if this is going to be the life path, I've got to go ahead and do it. I didn't really want to go back into academia because there's a, a prejudice against the idea of God and the soul, which is what I like to study about. And in the higher levels of academia, really throughout, although there are academics who believe in God and the soul, it's kind of frowned upon. So the school in San Francisco, the California Institute of Integral Studies, was unique in that they would recruit Ivy League professors, from Harvard and Stanford and places like that, to teach about the interlap between philosophy and physics. So I went there, and then I discovered string theory. I was watching Through the Wormhole with Morgan Freeman, which had just come out in 2010, and it was the second episode, and it was about the black hole war between Stephen Hawking and Leonard Susskind, the Stanford string theorist. And while I watched that, it reminded me of Carl Jung's near-death experience, the psychologist Carl Jung, famous for his theory of the collective unconscious mind with the archetypes. So in 1944, Carl Jung he broke his foot, then he had a heart attack, and then he had an out-of-body near-death experience. And when I read it first in his biography, his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, it seemed interesting, but it didn't stick out to me. But then when I saw this Through the Wormhole episode about string theory, then I saw, oh my God, this is a perfect match for what Carl Jung was describing. And that fell in line with the theory that Carl Jung worked on with the co-founder of quantum mechanics, Wolfgang Pauli, who was there right at the origins of what's called the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics with Heisenberg and Niels Bohr. Together, Jung and Pauli for 25 years worked on a theory that there are parallels or a mirror symmetry between the laws of physics and psychology, because mind and matter emerge from the same source, the collective unconscious archetypes, and specifically the ultimate archetype of the self. So I'll just say that what that is, this holographic string theory, and how it mirrors Carl Jung's near-death experience, because that's the foundation for my book, Psyche and Singularity, Jungian Psychology and Holographic String Theory. Yep, there it is. And then based on that book, which came out in 2018, I just released a class called Immortality and the Unreality of Death, a hero's journey through philosophy, psychology, and physics. And that's on my website, psycheandsingularity.com. So the website is the title of this book, psycheandsingularity.com. And you'll see the book there, a bunch of free videos I have about the book, and then a class, which is for sale, which is taking the basic ideas of this book and applying them to the hero's journey, the idea of the hero's journey, like Joseph Campbell wrote about where you go to the world of the dead and you come back with a boon to save civilization. So the boon that I take people, that I return people to the land of the living in that class, is this knowledge of the unity of the psyche or the soul or the self and the gravitational singularity. And it comes back to this parallel with holographic string theory and Carl Jung's near-death experience. And the basic parallel was so amazing to me was that when you wrap it all up, it's about black holes and how the information is conserved on the event horizon. Because Stephen Hawking was saying, oh, anything that falls into a black hole is gone from the observable universe forever. Leonard Susskind says, oh, that would violate the fundamental principle of information conservation, which is even deeper than the conservation of energy and mass. You can either create or destroy energy or mass, but you can either create or destroy the information that describes that mass, such as a bomb. If you blew up a bomb, then theoretically every atom of gas and metal should be able to be retraced back to the original bomb. Every trajectory of all of those atoms should be capable, if you had a computer powerful enough, with sensors powerful enough, to be retraced. But in a black hole, it would seem that information itself is erased from the universe. So Leonard Susskind started the black hole war with Stephen Hawking to find a way to save the information. And his theory came down to string theory, where he said, from one perspective, if you follow information past the event horizon of a black hole, it's gone. You can't get back out past the faster than light tidal force of space-time. But from the perspective of someone outside a black hole watching, you would see the strings, the fundamental strings of which everything is made. So string theory says the particles are actually even smaller strings, and they wrap around these compactified extra dimensions of space at every point of three-dimensional space. And the geometry of those extra dimensions of space with the strings wrapped around them accounts for the particles that we perceive. But at any rate, looking at a black hole from outside, you would see all the strings of all the atoms and of anything that fell in there smeared out around the event horizon. And then it would be released back out with the Hawking radiation, which is another story. But the universe is an inside-out black hole, expanding from a singularity instead of contracting into one. At the Big Bang, that's a singularity. A point of infinite density is the definition of a gravitational singularity. And instead of an event horizon, there's what's called the horizon of the cosmos, or the cosmic horizon. And that's where space-time is expanding away from the central singularity at the speed of light. Now, wherever you are in the universe, it appears from your perspective that you are the center of the universe, that you are the singularity from which the universe is expanding. So from our geocentric, Earth-centric perspective, the horizon of the cosmos is where space-time is expanding away from us at the speed of light. And every bit of information that goes past that cosmic horizon from the perspective of someone following it, that is then irretrievably lost because it can't come back in past the faster than light expansion of space-time. But from the perspective of someone inside the universe, it would appear that all that same information, the strings of which everything is made, would slow down and smear out around the entire inner horizon of the cosmos, this encompassing sphere, and then it would radiate back in with the cosmic microwave background radiation, the echo of the Big Bang, on these fundamental threads that are very elastic but too thin to see. And it creates what Leonard Susskind, the Stanford string theorist, who's also an atheist, he calls it a cinematic hologram, that our three-dimensional bodies, the planets, everything in the volume of the universe is a holographic movie, and that all of the bits of information from the past, the present, and the future of the entire universe are superimposed and conserved at each point of the encompassing sphere, as if on a two-dimensional holographic film. So that's very interesting. But what was really interesting to me was that that description of the cosmic horizon was exactly what Carl Jung said he experienced after his near-death experience. So he published Memories, Dreams, Reflections a year after he died. He didn't publish it. He had given instructions, after I die, you can publish this book. So he died in 1961. In 1962, that book was published, and it was about his heart attack in 1944. He said, I went in the hospital, And then I had a heart attack, and it seemed as if my body rose above the hospital, then above planet Earth, until I was 1,000 miles above the planet. He said, because I could look down and see the reddish sands of Arabia and the clouds and the continents. And I worked it out later, from what I could see, I would be about 1,000 miles up in space. And while he was up in space, he saw a huge boulder hollowed out into a temple, like he had seen in the Gulf of Bengal in India. They would take huge boulders on the beach and hollow them out into these elaborate temples. He saw one of those floating in space. There was a black Hindu in a white robe sitting in the lotus posture at the entrance, and behind him was a brilliantly lit room. And Jung said it felt as if the people to whom I belonged in reality were back there, and that if I could get in there, I would know everything about my past lives and my future life and where I was going. And then the psychic image of his doctor, Dr. H, rose up 1,000 miles up and he said, it seemed to me as if the earth had deputized him to come and fetch him back, that you still need to do some work here on earth. And then he woke up and he said it was horrible, because it seemed to me as if each of us in this three-dimensional universe lives in our own little box of illusion, our own little three-dimensional box of illusion, tethered to the horizon of the cosmos by a thread. And then he went on to describe that it seemed to him as if the past, the present, and the future were interwoven into some objective whole out at this horizon of the cosmos, and that he had experienced ecstasies there. Every night for a few weeks after this near-death experience, he would wake up at midnight and go into these blissful trances and experience all the different archetypes, like the marriage of Hera and Zeus and all the garden of pomegranates. He describes it as the most blissful experiences he's ever had. But the main point was, he said, it seemed to him as if the past, the present, and the future are interwoven at the horizon of the cosmos, and that each of us here lives in this little box of illusion tethered to the horizon of the cosmos by a thread. That's what holographic string theory says. Leonard Susskind's an atheist. He was specifically trying to disprove the ideas of an ensouled universe. So the irony is that the parallel between Carl Jung's parapsychological experience, this near-death experience, was perfect mirror symmetry with Leonard Susskind's holographic string theory, and the quantum physicist Wolfgang Pauli and Carl Jung, the great psychiatrist and psychologist, had predicted that there would be this mirror symmetry between psychology and physics. They both died before string theory was discovered, which was in the 1960s, the first version. Leonard Susskind was right there at the beginning of that one. And then he helped in the early 1990s with the Nobel Prize winning physicist Gerard 't Hooft from the Netherlands. They discovered the next level of string theory, where the strings are even smaller, too small to perceive, down at the Planck length, which is the technical term in physics. But at any rate, the reason I'm bringing that up is Jung and Pauli had the theory of this parallels between psychology and physics. Jung had this near-death experience, and this was all decades before holographic string theory came out. So they weren't trying to intentionally mimic string theory. And Leonard Susskind, an overt atheist, although sometimes he hems and haws on that, but one of the subtitles of his book is The Illusion of Intelligent Design. He thinks the idea of intelligently designed universe is an illusion. He wasn't trying to copy Carl Jung, given his atheistic stance. So the parallels are just they just emerged naturally, and that fulfills Jung and Pauli's prediction. And the psyche equals singularity, and this is where I'll stop and take a breath. Carl Jung in 1952, on Leap Day, February 29th, 1952, he wrote a letter speculating about the relationship between psychic energy and mass. So he learned about relativity theory from Einstein himself when they were both living in Switzerland from 1909 to 1912. And so Carl Jung thought psyche, or the soul, your whole podcast is named Psyche. It is its own entity. It's not a byproduct of a material brain or the nervous system. It is its own substrate of existence, the psyche. And therefore it has energy of its own. And if it has energy, it must be equivalent to mass, because Einstein said energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. If you take mass and you multiply it by the speed of light squared, you'll get the equivalent amount of energy. So there's an enormous amount of energy and even a little bit of mass. So if energy equals mass times the speed of light squared, then why can't we measure the mass of psychic energy? So he had originally thought maybe because it's too small, we don't have instruments that are sensitive enough. Then he said, no, maybe it's because it's infinitely intense. Because according to relativity theory, if you travel at the speed of light, you disappear from space and time. Because the faster you go, the length of it's called length contraction, according to special relativity. The faster a massive object moves, the more it's contracted in the direction of travel, and the slower its clock will go. If you hit the speed of light, then your length would be contracted to zero and your clock would stop. You would no longer be in space or time. So Carl Jung thought maybe the psychic energy is infinitely intense, and therefore it would not only surpass the speed of light, but it would be infinitely fast, which is another way of describing a gravitational singularity, which is a point of infinite density or of infinite gravity. So I mentioned special relativity. General relativity, the next step in physics, says gravity is equivalent to acceleration. So a point of infinite gravity is equivalent to a point traveling infinitely fast. It's infinitely intense. The wavelengths of energy are compacted into a point. So he went through all of the basics of relativity theory in his letter, and he concluded it with this equation. Psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. So the highest intensity of anything is infinite, and the smallest space possible is zero volume. And that's the definition of a gravitational singularity, a point of infinite density or infinite intensity. So psyche equals singularity. And the gravitational singularity is always surrounded by a horizon, either the event horizon of a black hole or the horizon of the cosmos. So putting that equation, psyche equals singularity, together with Carl Jung's near-death experience and the parallels with holographic string theory, indicate that the psyche, the soul, the self, is simultaneously the central point of the universe and each point of the encompassing horizon. And I equate the central point with the conscious self, the conscious ego, and our collective unconscious is the cosmic horizon where the archetypes are. The past, the present, and the future are conserved at each point of the cosmic horizon according to string theory, and according to the theory of the collective unconscious with the archetypes, which is a restatement, says Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli, of Plato's theory of the absolute ideas. And according to Plato, these absolute ideas are the source of being. Every tree that you see, for example, is a projection of the absolute perfect idea of a tree, which is eternally stored at the outermost sphere of the universe, according to Plato, in dialogues like the Phaedrus and the Timaeus and the Republic. So the collective unconscious mind, where the archetypes of existence are, where the absolute ideas are that Plato talks about, they're all superimposed at this encompassing sphere of the universe, and they project the three-dimensional world that unfolds through space and time. And so our psyche is the central point in the encompassing sphere of the universe. The central point's the conscious ego. The encompassing sphere is the collective unconscious. And our material bodies and everything else that's physical are holographic projections from that outermost sphere. And that's the knowledge that in the class that I'm selling on my website, Psyche and Singularity, called The Immortality and the Unreality of Death, I approach the fear of death, which Ernest Becker, the psychologist, or I don't know if he was technically a psychologist, but a Pulitzer Prize winning author, in 1972, he wrote a book called Denial of Death. And he said, post-Freudian psychology has brought us full circle back to Soren Kierkegaard, the great theologian of the 19th century. And the whole point is that the human psyche, whether God exists or not, the human psyche cannot unfold its full potential unless we believe we are eternal servants of an infinitely powerful God, because that's the most meaningful life you could imagine. And the human self hungers for meaning. And it will be, since the human imagination is infinite, it'll be satisfied by nothing less than an infinitely meaningful life. And your life isn't infinitely meaningful if it's not eternal. If it ends, that meaning isn't infinite, it's finite. And if your life isn't appreciated by some infinitely powerful spectator, then it isn't fully meaningful. This is through his reasoning from analyzing 20th century psychology, especially after Freud. So to become a hero in this hero's journey, you go to the land of the dead, and then you come back after battling unseen forces with some boon granted to you by the divine. And I'm saying the knowledge that Carl Jung came back with from his near-death experience was the Psyche equals singularity equation, even though he didn't say it that way, but if you translate his words, that's what it means. And I'm saying if you have this knowledge that you are an eternal gravitational singularity that's also one with the cosmic horizon, that helps you overcome the fear of death, and it helps you believe that you really are an eternal soul performing your heroics for an omnipresent, all-powerful God. And that God is the same singularity in the horizon of the cosmos. But the difference between God and us is you only know what you know, and I only know what I know. But God is experiencing everything that you're experiencing, and everything that I'm experiencing, and everything that every other singularity is experiencing. And that all gravitational singularities, although we appear in different points of space and time, we're all outside of space and time because of the nature of infinite gravity is equivalent to infinite acceleration, which puts you outside of space and time, like I talked about before. And if you apply what's called Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles, if you can't discern a difference between two things, then they are identical. Singularities they appear in different points of space and time, but they're structurally identical, a mathematical point, and they're outside of space and time. So they can't be differentiated by the fact that they appear in different points of space and time, and so they're all one. So we're all one soul, and yet simultaneously, we're all unique individuals with our own subjective point of view. And God is that one soul who simultaneously experiences what every other soul experiences. So in a nutshell, that's the worldview that I talk about in my book and that I talk about in the class. And I explain how if you digest this understanding of yourself and the cosmos, then it helps you address the fear of death, and it helps you achieve what Carl Jung called individuation, this wholeness where you integrate all of the oppositions of your life into one complete whole self. So I know that you're a psychologist, a psychotherapist, so I'm trying to lead people towards a healthy mind. For Carl Jung, the healthiest state of mind is when you realize you're one with the ultimate archetype of the self, which I equate with the singularity in the horizon of the cosmos. And he said the image of the self archetype that emerges in your mind during dreams to pull you towards individuation or wholeness through the union of opposites is a mandala, which is the Sanskrit word for a circle or a sphere with a central point. It's the symbol of wholeness, or the God archetype, or the self. And that when you're pulled by opposing demands in life, the self archetype in your collective unconscious will lead you towards wholeness in dreams and fantasies with these mandala symbols. If the laws of physics mirror the laws of psychology, and if in the laws of psychology the ultimate archetype of the self presents mandala imagery, what's the physical correlate of a psychic mandala image? I say black holes. It's a geometrically perfect mandala, a mathematical point, the singularity encompassed by a two-dimensional, perfectly thin sphere. So there's another parallel with Jungian psychology and physics. In holographic string theory, it combines quantum physics and general relativity, which had been at odds for decades before the early 90s. So there's another fulfillment of Jung's philosophy. The opposition between general relativity and quantum mechanics occurred within the mandala of a black hole. And I'm saying that union of those two opposing languages of physics also synthesized with psychology, the opposition between physics in general and psychology. They're also united in the geometrically perfect mandala of a black hole, including the inside-out black hole universe. So those are some of the basic ingredients that I talk about. I don't know if you wanted to comment on any of that stuff.
Oh yeah, man. There's so much in there that we could kind of follow and go deeper into. And I'll say too, one of the things that I like about this podcast is we can explore all these tremendous, profound ideas. But I always like to kind of explore maybe some of the personal or practical dimensions of it. And it seems like you kind of do that with like the hero's journey and the way that you kind of frame some of this stuff. What I would really like to do, if you're okay with it, I think it's going to connect to it, is maybe going back a little bit into your life. Could you explore how you first got into Carl Jung and his psychology? I'm always curious for my guests, kind of where they come from and how they come to some of their ideas.
Yeah, I didn't study him in school. I discovered Carl Jung. A girlfriend of mine I had in college had a portable Jung. I guess she had a class where she had to read them, and it didn't look like she'd opened the book. But I started reading through it, and I was fascinated. I was already enthralled with Plato. So I went to Boston College right out of high school. I wanted to go into the Army. I didn't want to go to school. I was taking woodworking and ceramics and study hall and everything that I could get that wasn't academic, because I'd had enough. And I even went and I took the Army test to get in the Army. I remember I was halfway through and the guys said, okay, that's it. And I thought I failed because I failed my driver's test the first time, like the computer question part. The last question I got wrong. So I was like, oh my God, I can't even take the Army test. He's like, no, you only had to get half of them right. And you got half of them right. So you're in. I was like, all right. And then he called my house and my dad answered the phone. And he's like, this is Sergeant so-and-so, recruiting. My dad's like, okay, never call here again. And then he said, you got to go to college. I said, I don't want to go to college. He's like, well, you owe me because I've raised you for 18 years. So you got to do this for me and you'll go to Boston College, because that's where I went. I was like, okay, what do you do? What do I got to study? Business, I guess. So I went to the business school and then I got to college. And at Jesuit school, you have to take a year of philosophy and a year of theology. So they offered the 6-credit class where you could get both of them out of the way. Usually a class is 3 credits. So this was double theology and philosophy. It was called Perspectives of Western Civilization. Pretty sure it's a good program they have at Boston College. Anyway, I was like, wow, this is cool stuff. I really like this. I remember reading St. Augustine's Confessions in the airport going up to Boston, like during Thanksgiving. I was like, well, this could have been written yesterday. I mean, just because something's ancient doesn't mean it's out of date. Anyway, I was horrible at the business math, and I had a knack for the philosophy. I thought just because it's easy, like math is hard, philosophy is easy. But then I saw across from the hall my friend John Coffey in our dorm. He was pulling his hair out and having a breakdown because this guy was acing all of his business math classes. And I was like, what's wrong, John? And he's like, he was reading philosophy. He's like, it doesn't make any sense. It's not consistent. I don't know, Whereas I'm like, oh, it's consistent. Here's this premise and this and that. And then I realized, okay, it's just different minds work differently. This is really complicated for him. And his business math, I can't get it. But it's not just because this is easy. So I felt better. And anyway, I had no choice. I was going to fail out of the business school. So I switched my major to philosophy and political science because they overlap a lot. Like Plato writes political philosophy and philosophy. So I got into Plato and his whole theory about the absolute ideas imprinted on the soul. Everything that you see in the material world is like a shadow or some kind of a mirror reflection. Those are the metaphors that he uses in the Republic, in the cave allegory. And they're images of some perfect form of that thing. And all of those perfect the forms of things exist out of this outermost sphere, which was a point that I didn't emphasize in my mind until string theory, when, decades later when I learned about that. So at any rate, then one day when I'm already reading these kinds of things, I see the portable Jung and I picked that up and I read that. That was right near the end of my undergraduate years. It was 1993. So after I graduated, then I lived on a tree farm for 4 years and just did my independent study of Plato and Nietzsche, quantum physics, but also Carl Jung, because it really helped me kind of bring the ancient ideas into a more modern language that people were familiar with. And Carl Jung himself, as I mentioned earlier, said that my theory of the archetypes of the collective unconscious, which developed throughout his life, but by the end of his life, especially after his near-death experience of the cosmic horizon, he said it's just a restatement of Plato's theory of absolute ideas. And those absolute ideas are stored up in a super celestial place, and that's the cosmic horizon, where Jung himself believed reality exists. So that's how I got into Carl Jung. And it just made a lot of sense to me, what he talked about, how your collective unconscious compensates the conscious ego, and these archetypes, how powerful they are, like the anima and the animus, the idea of a woman in a man, the anima, and the idea of a man and a woman, the animus, and how powerfully they influence our relationships. So it just seemed relevant to me, to everyday life. So I really studied it deeply. And he's a great writer. He's he's a deep thinker. It's not easy to read him, but it's worth it, because he's not just yammering. He's trying to make important points. And he was a clinical psychiatrist, and throughout his life, he was dealing with patients, helping them deal with neuroses. And Wolfgang Pauli, the Nobel Prize-winning co-founder of quantum physics, came to Jung for help psychologically, because he was having bar fights and living a reckless life. And when Jung realized, oh, this is the co-founder of quantum physics, I'll let my student analyze him, but I want to work with him as an intellectual partner. And they developed their theory of these parallels between physics and psychology. But anyway, that's how I got into Carl Jung. It was kind of an extension of Plato, and I just found it valuable, like a roadmap for how to live life in general. Plus, it was helping me understand all these complicated philosophical thoughts and how they related to physics, because Jung was also interested in that overlap of psychology and physics.
Absolutely. Okay, so thank you for kind of sharing kind of how you got into Jung. I know, since you mentioned Wolfgang Pauli, I wanted to ask a question about synchronicity, but before we go there, I'm just curious. Having gone to Boston College, did you come from a Roman Catholic background?
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
I grew up in Bethesda, Maryland. I went to Little Flower Grammar School from kindergarten through 6th grade. And then from 7th through 10th grade, I went to another Catholic school, St. John's, which was a military Catholic school run by Army sergeants and Catholic brothers. So that was a real trip. And then I went to public school for a couple of years, Bethesda Chevy Chase High School. But then I went back to Catholic school at Boston College. And then after that, I went back to Georgetown University to get a master's degree. So yeah, I was born and raised Catholic. And I still love the Catholic Church and the Catholic tradition. I don't agree with every point of Catholic dogma. Just philosophically, it's not like I have a real moral issue, but like St. Augustine, I read him a lot because he had the same understanding. Having been a student of the Neoplatonists, he agreed with this idea of everything is stored out at the outermost sphere of the cosmos. I'm also interested in the Vedanta philosophy of India, especially the Krishna-centric school of Vedanta, and specifically the Gaudiya Vaishnava school of Vedanta. And that's more commonly known as the Hare Krishnas, the bald-headed ponytail, dancing in the streets, that kind of an ecstatic movement. It's actually rooted in a really deep cosmology and philosophy. The Bhagavad Gita, for example, is the key book in that religious organization. That's Krishna speaking to Arjuna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra about why Arjuna should fight, even though it's his family members on both sides. Because you're an eternal soul and you have a duty to fight, you're a warrior. That appealed to me when I first read that. Growing up as a Christian, I've always thought it's really hard to turn the other cheek. If someone strikes you, it seems natural you strike them back. You don't have to hate them even. You can love them and still strike them back. It's just like, this is the laws of nature. And then the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna was like, oh, I'll just throw down my bow and just let them kill me. It's better. And then Krishna was like, though it appears that you're speaking learned words, really you're speaking like a fool. You should pick up your bow and fight. Here's why. First of all, you aren't going to kill anybody. Souls can't die. They're never created. They're never destroyed. You'll be just sending a soul out of its body, but everyone here is going to die anyway, eventually. And I'll let you in on a secret. I'm an omniscient God, so they're all going to die today, whether you help or not. So you might as well just do your duty and not worry about the results and fight. And that's how you can serve me. And that's the goal of life. There's the Bhagavad Gita, for example, in a nutshell. So, yeah, I was born and raised in the Roman Catholic Church. And I think that helped me appreciate Plato and gave me an edge on understanding philosophy, because I'd been having this religious training my whole life where a lot of these other kids didn't. So when they were confronted with philosophy, it was a new way of thinking for them. And I guess I had been trained well enough that it came easy to me. So, yeah, I was born in the Catholic tradition, and I still maintain those roots, and but it's expanded, out into more of a kind of what's the panentheistic philosophy. Consciousness permeates not only this universe, but every universe in the multiverse. And so,
yeah, that's actually one of the questions that I had for you. I'm always curious, kind of when people talk about God, kind of what they mean. I didn't know if you would hold to a type of panentheism or if it's more of a classical theism. I'm curious if you could kind of just go there for a second.
yeah.
I'm just eager to hear more about that.
Yeah, well, there was a book written, and I forget the title of it, but it was about the Gaudiya Vaishnava school of Vedanta, and that's the Hare Krishna philosophical worldview that a bunch of academics put together. And one of them wrote, and the reason I'm bringing it up is because I like the way he categorized that religion. And it was polymorphic by monotheism. That's how he described that.
That's a mouthful, but I like it.
Yeah, I like it too. Polymorphic, many forms of the dual gendered one God. Polymorphic by monotheism. So in that religion, God is Vishnu. But Vishnu has many forms. And not only does Vishnu have many Vishnu forms, but Vishnu has a feminine side, Lakshmi, and she has many forms. And for example, Sita and Rama. Sita's the female, the Lakshmi form, and Rama's a Vishnu form. Different schools say that different pairs of Vishnu and Lakshmi are the original pair. And the Gaudiya Vaishnavas say that Krishna and Radha are the original forms of Vishnu and Lakshmi. And but to give that overall religion a label, I like this polymorphic bimonotheism. And so there's these forms of God and goddess, and each of them, according to this theology, exists on their own spiritual planet, which is, which are the size of you can't even really put physical limitations on their size because these are spiritual planets. But the metaphor they use is each one of those planets is the size of one of our universes here in the material world. Each of those planets is filled with species, but they're all made of spiritual energy. And so each spiritual ecosystem, every living thing on those planets is God conscious. And their bodies are made of God consciousness, and they're blissful. And that's the majority of reality. But occasionally, a form of Vishnu goes to sleep on this, what's called the causal ocean, which is like a portion of the infinite spiritual sky, which is Brahman, the spiritual light. Those spiritual planets radiate their own light of consciousness, and it's called Brahman. And there's a portion of the ocean of Brahman called the causal ocean, which is the nascent material energy. So a form of Vishnu goes to sleep on that ocean, and while he's dreaming, he exhales all the bubble universes in our material multiverse out from the pores of his skin. And then he incarnates in the center of each one of those bubble universes as another form of Vishnu with a lotus flower coming out of his belly button. You've probably seen pictures. and the demigod Brahma is born on the top of that lotus flower. And then that demigod creates other demigods, and they engineer all the planets in each universe. And then Vishnu incarnates in the center of every material and spiritual atom in every bubble universe. So there's these three cosmic forms of Vishnu, the one from whom the multiverse expands and then inhales back into, and then another Vishnu in the center of every universe, and then another Vishnu in the center of every atom. And I equate that Vishnu with the gravitational singularity. There's a singularity in the center of every universe. That's the Big Bang. There's a singularity at every point of what's called the quantum vacuum, because it's infinitely dense, which means each point has infinite energy, which is a singularity. And all of the universes come from a singularity. So this equating God and the soul with a point of infinite density, that's the key that I'm bringing in my book and in the class. In the book, here's the details, and here's all the evidence comparing Carl Jung's psychology and holographic string theory. I go over the evolution of physics from Isaac Newton all the way through relativity, special and general, quantum mechanics, and string theory. Then I go through the history of philosophy from Plato through the atheistic empiricists, then back around up to Carl Jung. I show how the history of physics and philosophy is circling back to Plato's original academia. So I don't know how I got on that train of thought. I was just forgetting I lost the breadcrumbs trail of how I was getting there. Oh, religious was the key topic.
Well, and you were just kind of explaining how you understood, God, and I wonder if you're okay with this, if we can kind of transition to kind of synchronicity.
Yeah.
And I kind of want to set it up this way. As I was kind of, moving through your book, actually one of the endorsements was from a philosopher who I've had on the podcast a few times, Grant Maxwell, who I have, a high respect for. Yeah, he's great. And a tremendous kind of philosopher that thinks about Jung and a whole bunch of other philosophers. But he said in the endorsement of the book, which I thought was high praise, that it was one of the best books he's written that addresses the concept of synchronicity, that you did a great job kind of exploring that. Yeah. So I was wondering if you could just kind of set up what Jung and Polly were up to with that. And then if you think about synchronicity in any kind of personal or practical ways.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, first of all, shout out to Grant Maxwell, because he's the one who published the book, Psyche and Singularity, Persistent Press. I don't think he's working with that company so much. That's not his focus right now, but at any rate, so that was really flattering of him to want to publish the book. So he helped me edit it. He helped me take the dissertation and turn it into a book, and that was a hard process. So yeah, definitely Grant Maxwell is a deep thinking individual. So synchronicity, that's Carl Jung's theory of meaningful coincidences, which I think almost everyone has had. A lot of people just dismiss it as, the human mind seeks patterns and meanings everywhere, even where they don't exist. But it doesn't seem like that when you experience them. There's a numinous feeling. There's a feeling of some kind of a spooky cosmic force at work. And synchronicities have definitely shaped my life, and I look to them all the time for guidance, just like Carl Jung did. So meaningful coincidences. I've had a lot of synchronicities. They're pretty, some of them are pretty personal. But let me see if I can, let's see here. I don't want to get too much into the details of some of my intricate patterns of synchronicities. Sure. But let me just give an explanation of how I account for them. So the question is this: how can meaning perceiving minds and symbolically related physical events that occur in the outside world be connected? Where's the connection point? There's a meaningful connection, says Carl Jung. It's not a physical connection. His example, let's just keep it to his famous example of a scarab beetle. So one of his patients was this woman who he said had this overly Cartesian mind, Rene Descartes. He said there's mind and there's matter, and they're separate and they don't interact. It's hard to explain how they interact, but at any rate, the material universe is just an inert, soulless machine, this lady thought. And that kind of unplugged her from a greater unity with the cosmos as a whole. And she had a dream about a scarab beetle piece of jewelry. It's like a costly piece of jewelry in the shape of a scarab beetle. So for Carl Jung, following Freud, dreams have meanings, symbolic meanings. Your unconscious is trying to tell you something. So Jung said that the scarab beetle in the Egyptian religion was the sign of resurrection from the dead. But more importantly, all synchronicities point to the ultimate archetype of the self, the archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites. Synchronicities point to the union of opposites because they represent a union of the ultimate pair of opposites, which is mind and matter. All pairs of opposites can be either categorized as mental or as physical. So when mind and matter themselves are united, that incorporates all of the other pairs of opposites, be they physical or psychological. So where do mind and matter meet in synchronicities, you experience them, but where's the physical location where they could have been tied together? And I'm saying it's out at the horizon of the cosmos. That's where the archetypes of the collective unconscious are superimposed at each point on this holographic film. Every point of space and time, the entire past, present, and future of your entire biography is interwoven with the entire history and future of the universe at each point of this horizon. So when things unfold, when they're projected from that holographic film and they unfold in the cinematic hologram that we're experiencing, for them to unfold in a way that seems to be scripted in a symbolically meaningful way makes more sense when you see, well, my mind and my psyche is merged with all of the universe. So for there to be some connection between the way things are unfolding. So to get back to Carl Jung's scarab beetle example of synchronicity, he's analyzing this lady. She's telling him about her dream. As she's telling him about a dream, he hears an insect buzzing against the window. And he looks, and it's a beetle. It's not a scarab beetle, but it looks similar to that. And it was the kind of a beetle that wasn't regularly seen in that part of Switzerland. So he opens the window, he catches the beetle in his hand, and then he presents it to her, and he says, here's your scarab beetle. And when she experienced that meaningful coincidence between nature and her telling of her dream, that got her over the hump of not being able to believe that the cosmos is infused with meaning. She could see from that nature is not separate from the psyche, and that's what was a meaningful coincidence. I've had others. You know what? I'll tell one. Like I said, these synchronicities are kind of personal, but I'll tell one because I mentioned her earlier. You said, where did I get in contact with Carl Jung? And it was a girlfriend I had in college. So she was important to me. But then after college, I was a monk. I was a celibate monk, and I was just living and studying. And so she got another boyfriend, and I wasn't sure who she was going to be with. And so he was coming up there to go get her. So I went up there, and I'm like, well, I don't know how this is going to play out. But I was like, well, if he's going to marry her, he was an atheist, and I knew the guy. I liked the guy. I was like, well, the least I can do is maybe try to help him see that there's, God, that there's a spiritual force in the universe. Because if this young woman who I love is going to marry this guy, I want her to have a good man, and I think he should be evolved psychologically to see the greater meaning. Anyway, I said to him, haven't you ever experienced synchronicities? Everyone's experienced meaningful coincidences. He's like, as a matter of fact, I did. When I was about to come up here and I called this mutual friend of ours, I hung up the phone and I turned on the sink in the kitchen, and the faucet popped up and the water started spewing everywhere. I was like, yeah, but like that. Because he didn't know if she was going to go with me or if she was going to go with him. So eventually she went with him. That's fine. They didn't get married right away. So years later, I'm talking to her, and then our relationship was brought up again. And I suggested that she and I could get back together, and she was like, nope, that's not going to happen. So I was like, okay, that hurts. I went home, I turned on the faucet in the kitchen, and boom, the sink pops up out and the water shooting everywhere. The only time that's ever happened in my life. So what are the odds that it happened to him and it happened to me right after both of us had queried this young lady about
Yeah,
marriage?
that's amazing.
That's a synchronicity right there.
Oh yeah.
It took the sting out, because I was like, okay, that really sucked. And that was like a mule kick to my heart. But what a cool synchronicity that
Oh
one is.
yeah. No, thank you so much for sharing that. That's really cool. So
Right.
so Todd, I kind of wanted to ask you this question too, and I was kind of watching some of your videos, and this kind of came up as a really cool, I think, reflection and kind of interpret, or just kind of a way that you're kind of fleshing out some of the ideas in the book. You talk about, in terms of like Jungian psychology, the idea of projection,
Hmm.
and then maybe how we're seeing that in our larger social political landscape in the United States in terms of all the polarization.
Oh, sure.
Can you kind of maybe speak to that, like how you understand projection being related to this political polarization?
Yeah, I talk about that. I do talk about it in the book. I focus it on that issue even more in the class, immortality and the unreality of death, because it's the hero's journey. And how do you deal with all of this animosity that's in society all the time?
Right.
And it's in what Carl Jung called an ineradicable tendency of the human psyche to project the shadow onto others. So we all have a shadow side. We all have things about ourselves that we don't want to admit because they're ugly. We do petty things, and some of us do even horrible things, but we don't want to admit the weaknesses that we have. And then when we join a group of like-minded people, then our sense of individual moral responsibility is reduced in proportion to the size of the group. So then the whole group will project its shadow onto other groups. An individual will project a shadow, but at least you might be dimly aware, okay, I'm also not perfect. And as I'm accusing this guy of doing, being a hypocrite, I know I'm also kind of a hypocrite. But once you get into a group mass-minded setting, then the group has like no filter, and they project their shadow entirely and innocently onto the other group. And that other group does the same. So both groups see the other as the incarnation of everything evil and idiotic. And they see themselves as relatively pure. Sure, my group does some bad things, but oh yeah, and even if it's horrible, they're like, yeah, but the other group's much worse. So this shadow projection, like Jung said, it's ineradicable. It cannot be stopped. So you're going to project your shadow, but then at least you should know that is what you're going to do, and you're going to do it unconsciously. It's going to happen. But after it happens, then you should always be searching for it so that you can withdraw it back in. It's like, okay, why do I hate this guy so much? What is it about him? And I remember even as a kid, someone had told me this, and it just made sense to me. It's like, if you really, really hate somebody, it's because you see something about yourself that you don't like in that person. And that is what you hate them for what they are. Plus you're adding on your own self-hatred that you projected that part that you hate about yourself onto them. So it can help you learn what it is about yourself that you should improve by learning what it is about others that you hate so much, because it's probably something about yourself that you don't want to admit. But yeah, the shadow side and projection. And I say, okay, it should be easy to admit that you project your unconscious mind onto other people when you incorporate the idea of psyche equals singularity, because the singularity projects space-time out at the Big Bang, and then the singularity exists at each point of this infinitely hot sphere, the horizon of the cosmos. I didn't mention that it's infinitely hot before, but Leonard Susskind says it is, from the perspective of people looking at it from deep inside the universe. Each point from the past, present, and future of the entire universe is superimposed at each point of this spherical horizon, and it projects inward on strings of energy with the echo of the Big Bang. The entire three-dimensional universe is a psychic projection from the collective unconscious mind. It's the essence of the psyche to project. That's what it does. So to say, okay, no, I don't project my unconscious mind to other people. Well, if psyche equals singularity is true, then you do, because that's the nature of the soul. That's the nature of the gravitational singularity and its encompassing horizon. So it helps you to admit that you project your shadow on other people when you realize I am a psyche, which is a singularity and a horizon, and the essence of them is to project reality into existence. And the shadow part is the tricky part. You can also project your idea of the inner God onto other people, and then you start to adulate them, and that is also in political parties. You see the political party as, kind of a God substitute. They can do no wrong. They're all powerful and all good. And the people who are against my party are, infidels. They're the enemies of God. They're the enemies of what's good. So when you combine mass-mindedness, which is just combining your ego with a bunch of other egos, your sense of moral responsibility gets diminished in proportion to the size of the group. And then, like the individual psychology, you project your shadow. Group psychology is the same. It projects its shadow. And then what's interesting is when you're one-sided enough for long enough, the collective unconscious compensates your one-sided ego by building up an equal and opposite unconscious side until it gets to a point where they flip. And you call that enantiodromia. The conscious side becomes so one-sided that it flips and the collective unconscious compensation comes to the surface. And I think you see that happening in the United States of America today. I hear a lot of times people say the issues from the right wing and the left wing have flipped. It's like the right wing used to be against freedom of speech. They didn't want all kinds of, pornographic expression and atheistic ideas, and they were kind of oppressed that. And the liberals were more freedom of speech, say whatever, no matter how heinous, freedom of speech. Well, now that seems to have kind of flipped. And different issues politically, at any rate, I've noticed people talk about that, like the neoconservatives, which is a group I've studied because they're rooted in this Platonic political philosopher, Leo Strauss. So the neocons, they're called. They were in the Bush administration 20 years ago, and they helped to get the United States involved in the Iraq war. At any rate, now they have migrated back to the Democratic Party, which is, the Democratic Party hated the neocons 20 years ago, and now they've embraced them. And so everything, it just seems to be flipped because both parties are inevitably one-sided. Both of them build up the counterposition in their collective unconscious, and then it flips. So that kind of shadow projection, one-sidedness, and it results in this flip-flopping of principles. And that's the state we're in now, and it's pretty dire. It's psychologically unhealthy. And I think, like this idea of psyche equals singularity, it could help unite these opposites. The nature of the self archetype, which is represented by the psyche equals singularity equation, it produces mandalas in dreams and fantasies to lead an ego towards wholeness through the union of opposites. And I think, for example, in the American society, we've got this division between the left and the right, which is always there, but it's more and more intense and more hateful every day. Well, I think if people on both sides could say, the evolution of psychology and philosophy and physics seems to indicate that we've come full circle back to Plato, and that each of us is this point of infinite density. We're one, all with each other. We're all merged at this encompassing horizon of the cosmos. That's the bigger, grander cosmic picture. I think we could unite these opposing worldviews with that equation. And I honestly believe that's why it's emerging now. Because Jung said the collective unconscious compensates the conscious ego, both on the individual psychological level and on the social level. And the split between the left and the right is so intense that if Jung is correct, the self-archetype should be compensating us with some kind of a mandala. And I'm saying the mandala that's symbolized by the psyche equals singularity equation. So I take that equation, psyche equals singularity. It represents the archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites. So each side of that equation can itself be broken into its own constituent pair of opposites. So I divide the psyche into conscious ego, collective unconscious, and I divide the singularity into singularity and cosmic horizon. So the conscious ego pole of the psyche is equated with the central singularity, and the collective unconscious pole of the psyche I equate with the cosmic horizon. That's a mandala. It's a sphere with a central point. And I believe that it's the unifying worldview we need right now to unite all of these opposites, which are fueled by all kinds of shadow projections and things like that.
Yeah, that's really great, man. Okay, so thank you so much, Todd, for coming on and
Sure.
just you know helping us understand like your argument and bringing up all these wonderful ideas and thank you for following me in terms of thinking about some of this at a practical level. I would love anyone to kind of check out your book. And I'll make a quick plug that if anyone has, I think it's like Kindle Unlimited. I think it's actually free right now on Kindle Unlimited.
Oh, wow.
Is there a place that you would want people to go? I think you've mentioned your website. Maybe that's it. Maybe it's your YouTube page. If
Yeah.
someone's really wanting to kind of access your work and connect with you, I'll include the links in the show notes. Where would you like them to go?
Yes. Psyche and Singularity.com.
Okay. Okay.
That's the
I'll
website.
include that in the show notes for sure.
Yeah. It's got the book and the class, Immortality and the Unreality of Death, A Hero's Journey Through Philosophy, Psychology, and Physics. I go through a bunch of like PowerPoint slides with words from these, mostly from this book, and videos. And it's a more of a taking this book, breaking it down into bite-sized chunks with the focus on the hero's journey, which is unique to the class. That's not so much in the book. How to, go to the land of the dead and return to society with this boon to share with the world, which I'm saying is the psyche equals singularity equation. But yeah,
Gotcha.
psyche and singularity.com. You can find the book, the class, all my YouTube videos. I teach at the College of Southern Maryland, so all the classes I put on YouTube for the class are there. So there's a lot of material. If anyone's interested in the kind of ideas I've been talking about, you can find it there.
Okay. Wonderful. Hey, thank you so much for your time and I hope that we continue to connect in the future.
Sure. Thanks a lot for having me on. And it was interesting to hear Grant Maxwell's been on here. He's a friend of mine, and he published this book.
Yeah, that's so cool. No, I'm gonna kind of message him later and tell him we had this great conversation. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you to Todd.
Okay, Kike, thanks a lot.